Okay, so we have all our panelists here now, so if the audience could take their seats. Today we have 4 papers on Augustine and human dignity. And without further ado, I'll ask the first to come up, Professor Dan Burns from the University of Dallas, speaking about Augustine on the meaning of human dignity.
Thanks, Chris. Say? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thanks, Chris, and thanks to everybody else for organizing this panel. I'm really glad we were able to do this. Thanks. We are talking today about Augustine on human dignity. Human dignity is a term that Augustine never uses, so you should be immediately suspicious of all of us. Augustine is so clearly always relevant to everything that it's always tempting to make him seem even more relevant by interpreting him anachronistically, fitting him into our own categories of thought. I don't think that's what the 5 of us are doing today, and I'll explain why, but you shouldn't be afraid to push us on this. The burden of proof should always be on the person who wants to use uniquely modern terminology in interpreting a pre-modern thinker. So let me try to meet that burden of proof. I take it that today when we say human dignity, we mean something along the following lines. We mean something that's inherent in human beings by virtue of our humanity, that demands from other human beings a respect that should be shown through external signs, and that therefore affects the way we should treat each other in society, including political society. That's what I think we more or less mean by human dignity today. If I'm wrong about that, you may just want to tune out for the next 14 and a half minutes. But if I'm right about that basic meaning of what we call human dignity, Augustine does talk about it without using the term. It's in one of his early works of moral philosophy. And he talks about what makes us as humans different from the other animals and superior to them, and also what we as humans owe each other in light of that specifically human difference. That's right there in the text. And so I'm happy to call that Augustine's discussion of human dignity. It appears in a dialogue of Augustine's, Book 1 of On Free Choice, and almost everything that I'm going to say from here on will presuppose my own book-length interpretation of that dialogue, which I defend in a manuscript that I might finally complete over this Christmas break. One thing that's unusual about this dialogue is that its argument rests hardly, if at all, on any specifically Christian teaching. It rests instead on a dialectical examination and refining of moral opinions from Augustine's own time, opinions that in their essentials, I argue, remain common among both Christians and non-Christians even today. In fact, there's good evidence that in Augustine's view, opinions like these, our philosophical views on human dignity, will, as a rule, tend to determine how we interpret Christian revelation. And so, for example, if you live in a society where Christians imbibe a liberal view of human dignity, so to speak, with their mother's milk, Christians will tend to interpret Christianity in light of that liberal view of human dignity rather than vice versa. And that may even be unavoidable. So in any case, when we're trying to get these philosophical questions right, the stakes are pretty high. So let me talk about what Augustine actually says in this text on human dignity. Human dignity, and the way that it demands that we treat human beings, has to be understood in contrast to the way that we legitimately treat non-human animals. How do we treat them? We enslave them. We order them around, we expect them to obey us, we punish them if they don't. And maybe most importantly, we do all this without generally feeling any need to explain why we have the right to do it. We don't think there's any intrinsic injustice in our exercising dominion over non-human animals according to our own will and for our own purposes. But if a person, a morally serious person, wants to rule over other human beings, he always at least feels the need to explain why it is right for him to do so. Even in a society like Augustine's, whose moral intuitions about slavery in particular are quite different from ours, even Romans who believed in human slavery at least still thought it needed a justification, which neither we nor they would generally say about oxen or horses. And so this is the first, most basic evidence for human dignity found in common human moral intuition. We all acknowledge some excellence or superiority in human beings as compared to other animals that requires us to justify ourselves before we seek to rule over other human beings by force. This superiority is clearly not based on anything physical, otherwise elephants would have the right to rule human beings. And according to Augustine, the superiority that is the source of our human dignity is to be found instead in our mind, which he identifies as the capacity for reason. So the next question is, how does that human dignity require us to treat each other? If another person's dignity requires us to have a justification before we try to rule over them by force, what kind of a justification could that be? What would be a valid justification that would not be a violation of the other person's dignity? Augustine gives an example, an extreme case, but a revealing one. He says that if you had a set of rulers, political rulers, who were abusing their authority to commit major acts of immorality and to permit or encourage everyone else to also commit major acts of immorality, he says that at some point, when that situation got sufficiently grave, one could obviously think here of Nazi Germany, at some point, he says, if a virtuous person is able to seize power from those immoral rulers by force, subjugate them, and bestow power instead on virtuous rulers, that act of forceful subjugation could be morally justified and would not be a violation of human dignity. This is, again, an extreme hypothetical, which is why it doesn't contradict Augustine's own famous political conservatism. He thinks that a hypothetical like this is rarely, if ever, actualized, and that in general you should put up with your immoral rulers and not try to overthrow them. But the fact that he grants the legitimacy of this case in principle tells us a few things about his view of human dignity. It tells us, for one thing, that the source of our human dignity, the basis for the respect that we owe each other as humans, has to do with not only whether you possess a mind, but how you're using it. Human dignity for Augustine does not just have an on-off switch. It has a dimmer switch. What you owe someone based on their human dignity depends on how they are employing their mind in its dominion over creation, including over other human beings. The more someone is using his mind to impede other people from living virtuously, the more justification there is for stopping him from doing so by force. Again, with the major caveat, if you're actually able to, which you rarely are. And so if human dignity depends to some extent on virtue, then of course the question becomes, what is virtue? Here's Augustine's answer to that. Human virtue is a quality of the human soul by which our life is ordered toward excellent and distinctively human activities. Because those activities are distinctively human, they have to be self-conscious. Animals are capable of blind obedience, but only humans can be self-conscious. True virtue requires that we know why we're acting the way we're acting. That is, it requires us to know ourselves, to know what it means to be human, and to know why it's good, for the kind of beings that we are, to act virtuously rather than viciously. That knowledge of human nature, in turn, depends on at least some knowledge of the divine or superhuman nature that sets limits to human possibilities. To pick just the clearest example, the divine nature determines what will happen to humans when we die, and we are the kind of beings that care about that question. Finally, this knowledge of human nature and of the human good cannot be an abstract or academic knowledge, but needs instead to fully inform our complete life as human animals with all of our activities and desires, so as to effect a complete reordering of our lives around the human good. Virtue itself, therefore, is not identical to that human good. Virtue is the quality of soul by which we orient our entire life around or toward the human good. But virtue itself is also more choice-worthy than all the individual goods, the earthly goods that we encounter in our daily lives. And so the human good must be the sort of thing that encompasses virtue, but also goes beyond it. The most reasonable definition of that human good, therefore, is the following. The human good is living in light of the truth, or as Augustine puts it, living by the light of the mind. The truth here is the truth about all things, and especially about God and the soul, the human soul. Human dignity consists in living, in fully living, by the light of the human mind, that is to say, by our reason. So again, this is not a uniquely Christian teaching. I don't think that Augustine believed he was saying anything that Cicero wouldn't have agreed with too. But the important point is Augustine does agree with it all in full, and he never retracts it at any point in his career. Now, what are some conclusions to be drawn from this view of human dignity? One conclusion is that even our vices manifest our human dignity. Every human vice, even those that may seem most animalistic, involves some activity of the mind and is some kind of reaching out for a good that transcends mere animal life. Our vices manifest our human dignity, but our vices can also impede our human dignity and that of others by preventing us from living in the light of the truth. Y'all were looking for some more practical conclusions, weren't you? All right, let's get to more practical conclusions. I've said nothing here about which concrete social and political arrangements can foster human dignity in this Augustinian sense. It's a whole other set of questions. Augustine wrote less on those questions than we would wish he had, although everything he did write on them is a pearl of great price. For now, I'll just say I think what I've said is enough to set aside some confusions that result when modern Christians look for social and political arrangements that could foster human dignity in a non-Augustinian sense. And so let me give a few examples of those. The first is about religious freedom. Catholics especially often speak about religious freedom in terms of human dignity, in part because of the Declaration on Religious Freedom, whose first two words are human dignity. According to Augustine, it is essential to human dignity that we seek the divine and that we seek to live our full lives in light of the truth about the divine. Religious indifference is an affront to human dignity. Idolatry is also an affront to human dignity. We're supposed to be seeking the truly divine, not base images unworthy of the divine. It's very easy to make an Augustinian case in favor of a general preference for religious freedom. That is a preference that people should, as a rule, be using their own mind in seeking out the divine and in living in accord with what they believe to be the truth about it. That was always Augustine's own preference. And this case for religious freedom gets even easier to make when the alternative is a hostile secularism, compared with which even very false religions look better than nothing. But it's equally easy on Augustinian grounds to say that this general preference has exceptions for egregious cases, and Augustine himself made such exceptions. Religious freedom does not have to extend to religions whose false conceptions of the divine are especially degrading to the human beings who practice them. Public restrictions on Satanism are not an affront to human dignity. An Augustinian doesn't get embarrassed when trying to explain these exceptions, as many liberals today do. In case that one wasn't controversial enough, let's do marriage. Would an Augustinian grant civil recognition to non-Augustinian forms of marriage, including remarriage after divorce, as well as gay marriage, both of which Augustine would obviously regard as offenses against the truth and hence against human dignity? I'm not going to answer that question because there are many practical, potentially Augustinian considerations on both sides of those questions. You could talk about political and economic utility. You could talk about the welfare of children. You could talk about the fact that not all violations of human dignity are created equal. Augustine, for example, rather famously favored civil toleration for prostitution, not because he thought it wasn't an affront against human dignity, but because he thought that trying to suppress it would lead to even worse violations of human dignity. That is, violations of the truth about our sexual nature. So that's all complicated. What's not complicated is this. Augustine is not worried that we would be affronting anybody's human dignity by failing to show respect for forms of cohabitation that contradict the divinely ordained truth about human nature and its sexual differentiation. That's just not an Augustinian concern. And that same consideration would apply even more clearly to our controversies about gender identity. Finally, to zoom out a little bit from particular controversies. Many Christians today would defend popular political participation or political freedom in general by referring to innate human dignity. That line of thought has a very limited Augustinian basis. For Augustine, there is always a certain default presumption in favor of political freedom. Beings created, that is, with the dignity of rational animals, should have some chance to live by the light of their own mind, and that obviously requires a certain freedom. That is a presumption, you could say, for Augustine, but it's what the lawyers call a rebuttable presumption. Our mind gives us dignity, but our mind is meant to be used well. And there is simply no Augustinian basis for a view of human dignity that would leave us politically blind as to whether people are living up to that human dignity. The notion that human dignity somehow automatically requires democracy or self-government or popular sovereignty, without any regard for the question of whether the populace will use that power or freedom for good or for ill, that's a notion that Augustine expressly denies. Rather, and I'll close with this one, at one point in this very text, he addresses the case of a man who kills an oppressive master in order to win his own freedom, and whether this is a morally acceptable action. Augustine's response is, before we can answer that question, shouldn't we ask how he's planning to use that freedom? That, I think, is the unavoidable conclusion for anybody who shares what Professor McIntyre yesterday called the teleological view of human dignity, which he found in Aquinas, that I found in Augustine, and that ultimately, I think, is the view of human dignity shared by the whole Western philosophical tradition prior to modernity. Thank you.
Next, we will have the one theologian in the midst of a bunch of political scientists, Dr. Tom Harmon from the University of St. Thomas, my colleague or partner in crime from Christendom, from Empire to Christendom class, and he'll be talking about, is it walls then that make men Christians? St. Augustine on the dignity of the multitude.
I find myself in this situation a lot, being the sole theologian among political scientists, but that's actually when I'm happiest. So I'm very happy to be sharing a panel with my good friends here. I'm also happy that my talk is after Professor Burns' talk, because I think that there are two ways to explain human dignity in the light of the thought of Augustine. One is to emphasize the common dignity of all human beings based on their creation in the image of God and their redemption by Jesus Christ. The other is to emphasize the variegation in human dignity based on virtue or holiness. So that's where you get maybe talk about the dimmer switch. So there's sort of two aspects of human dignity that we can pull from Augustine's thought, I think. And keeping both of those in mind is important, and not confusing them is also important. So there's a sense in which you can lose dignity, to reference our plenary from last night, according to Augustine, and there's also a sense in which you can't. And I think making sure that those two conceptions of dignity, related and connected as they are, need to be kept clear and distinct. But since I'm the theologian up here, I'm going to not shy away from theological topics. This is going to be largely a talk about soteriology, and how soteriology, or at least Augustine's soteriology, shows us something true about human dignity. I'm also glad that I came after Professor Burns, because I think without his important argument, there's a danger that my own argument might be heard to sort of flatter some of our contemporary democratic prejudices, with which Augustine would probably have small sympathy. Let me begin by saying that in his aptly titled article, "Human Dignity Was a Rarity Before Christianity," David Bentley Hart observes, "It is practically impossible for us today to appreciate the magnitude of the scandal that many pagans naturally felt at the bizarre prodigality with which the early Christians were willing to grant full humanity to persons of every class and condition." Okay? Hart's examples, Celsus, Eunapius of Sardis, Julian the Apostate, and Porphyry of Tyre, include two of Augustine's main interlocutors, one direct and the other sort of indirect. He talks a lot about Porphyry in a lot of his books. He doesn't talk quite so much about Julian, but Julian seems to be in the background of a lot of what he writes. Each of Hart's examples are highly educated men, and depending on what you think of the acumen and way of life of Julian and Eunapius, all of them have some claim to the mantle of philosopher. Broadly speaking, and without meaning to get into disputes about philosophic taxonomy, each of them were in the Platonic tradition. Okay? In Platonic philosophy, both in Plato and in the Platonic tradition, broadly conceived, that's my get out of jail free card. I don't want to get into the Platonisms within Platonisms debate. There's a cleft between the few and the many, based on a distinctive anthropology most famously expressed in the image of the tripartite soul. That leads to a situation in which the destiny of different types of human beings, both in this life and in some Neoplatonic reflection after death, are separate. The tripartite soul is divided among, this might be review for a lot of you, but anyway. The tripartite soul is divided among appetite, spiritedness, and reason. Within different people's souls, a particular part dominates, which gives that individual's life a particular orientation. Appetite and spiritedness are only capable of pursuing temporal objects, while reason is capable of reaching to the eternal and transcendent. The lives of those in whose souls appetite and spiritedness dominate are therefore confined by space and time and subject to material particularities like environment, politics, and culture. Their souls are shaped by these factors. The best they can hope for is that they might dedicate themselves to something larger than themselves, their political community, for example, in which some of their ignorance and vices might be constrained and oriented toward comparatively higher goods. These are the non-philosophic many. By contrast, the lives of those in whose souls reason dominates are able to be directed toward the highest things, which transcend particularities of circumstance. They pursue the truth by a life in philosophy. What results from the schema I've just described is an anthropological, psychological partition of human beings. The extreme rarity of the philosopher, combined with the extreme difficulty of becoming a philosopher, see Plato's allegory of the cave, inter alia, means that the few and the many will pursue very different ends. The necessity of the philosophic few to live among the philosophic many is what provokes many of the highest reflections in Platonic political philosophy, including as it touches on religious practice. In Neoplatonic thought, the movement is toward a classification of various types of mediators that can intercede for the different types of human beings to reach salvation. For instance, Porphyry of Tyre holds out different ways of purification for the different types of human being, some of which have the potential to usher souls into life after death, and some of which do not. So that there is no way to provide a common salvation to all. By contrast, the Christian proposition that there exists a single way of salvation, sufficient for all human beings and all types of human beings, that issues in a single way of life, that in principle does not destroy the real differences among human beings. I'm sorry, I added that there. Okay, so in principle does not destroy the real differences among human beings. It does not force philosophers, for instance, to abandon their pursuit of eternal truth, or force non-philosophers to embark on a difficult, perhaps impossible course of metaphysical studies. This Christian proposition was bound to be appealing. As Michael Bland Simmons argues, this perception that Christ alone offered universal salvation regardless of one's social, economic, gender, class, racial, age, and even moral status was an increasingly attractive component that gave it the edge in its competition with all the other salvation cults of the empire, unquote. As Pierre Manant puts it, Christianity's point of impact is the separation between the few and the many. What Christianity attacks is not social or political inequality, but the pertinence of the distinction between the few and the many, the philosopher and the non-philosopher, with regard to the capacity to attain or receive the truth, unquote. Augustine also dedicates the first part of De Vera Religione to an evaluation of Platonic esotericism. It's also the subject of his first letter, and also the Contra Academicos, Book 3, the latter half. He says in the De Vera Religione, this is Augustine, however philosophers may boast, anyone can understand that religion is not to be sought from them. For they take part in the religious rights of their fellow citizens, but in their schools teach divergent and contrary opinions about the nature of their gods and of the chief good, as the multitude can testify. So apparently they're not very good at this point at esotericism. Recognizing the appeal of the Christian proposition, the Platonist philosopher Porphyry of Tyre, probably with the support of the Emperor Diocletian, as the tip of the spear of the intellectual component of the Great Persecution, attempted to provide an alternative to the Christian proposal of a universal way of salvation. As Augustine reports, Porphyry admits that he has not found, quote, a universal way for the liberation of the soul, liberande animae universali sua. given that for Porphyry there's a division between the few capable of philosophy and the many who are not, so far as their ability to attain and live according to wisdom, there cannot be a single way of salvation. That means both that salvation for the different groups of human beings happens by different methods, and also that the salvation they receive is different. I think this is mine.
It is now.
Okay. Not anymore. Sorry. All right. So Porphyry's soteriological schema involved, in Simmons' words, a comprehensive soteriological paradigm whose individual stages served the purpose of cleansing that part of the soul that was appropriate for the recipient's spiritual or metaphysical level. Porphyry delineated the types of human being on the basis of which part of the soul dominates within them, appetite, spiritedness, or reason. At the height of the non-philosophic ways of salvation is the practice of the civic virtues. Simmons argues, the benefits provided by the ways of salvation for those directed by appetite or spiritedness, however, were not only for the souls who received them, the city and ultimately the empire benefited as well, for those were expected to practice the civic virtues for the well-being of their city and empire. On the basis of which part of the soul dominates, there's a distinct way of salvation and a distinct type of salvation. Nevertheless, Porphyry was able to offer something he could plausibly say was universal salvation by holding out hope of some type of salvation to all types of human beings. As Simmons remarks, it was the closest that Greco-Roman polytheism ever came to a semblance of universalism, which was in turn constructed as a counter-assault upon Christian claims that in Christ alone was found the via salutis universalis animae liberandi. What Porphyry really offers is a coordinated system of three different ways of salvation, with three different types of salvation as their terms. But as Augustine noticed, there's a real question about whether the cleansing of the spiritual soul and the ascent to the ethereal realm after death ought to be called salvation at all, according to Porphyry's highest philosophic principles. After all, for Porphyry, true salvation involves the cleansing of the intellectual soul and unity with the One, which is only open to the true philosopher. The sort of second-best way of salvation Porphyry was able to offer the non-philosophic multitude was, by the way, historically not persuasive. In the Platonic schema, only the philosopher is capable of transcending the political community. Viewed from the standpoint of the Christian proposal, the pagan alternative seems to make the multitude into city fodder, in Peter Augustine Loller's nice phrasing. Augustine shows us the dynamic at work in his narration of the story of Victorinus in Confessions 8:2. Victorinus was a famous teacher of rhetoric and translator of philosophic books. It's also likely, by the way, according to groundbreaking research by Pierre Hadot, that Victorinus drew deeply on the thought of Porphyry. If so, the reason for Augustine's choice to relate the story of Victorinus becomes clear. It's not only that both Simplicianus and Augustine saw Augustine's own situation in the situation of Victorinus, who was a fellow African teacher of rhetoric and student of philosophy, but Augustine also observes that Victorinus was, according to Augustine's presentation, a Porphyrian philosopher who had taken part in the presumably theurgic rites recommended by Porphyry. But Augustine makes clear elsewhere that these philosophers who participate in sacrilegious rites do not do so by choice, but out of fear of the non-philosophic multitude. Augustine says that Porphyry was under the domination of these envious powers whose influence he was at once ashamed of and afraid to throw off. Just so, when Victorinus is on the verge of conversion, it is the necessity of appearing within the church. Is it walls that make Christians? Victorinus quips to Simplicianus. That holds him back. He is afraid to, quote, offend his friends, important people and worshippers of these demons. In contrast, when Victorinus chooses to make the final step and convert, he is given a choice to do so privately. Instead, he boldly chooses to make his profession publicly. Quote, for there had been no salvation in the rhetoric he had taught, yet he had professed it publicly. Obviously, therefore, he should be in less fear of your meek flock when he was uttering your word, since he had no fear of the throng of the deluded when uttering his own. Victorinus' willingness to join this Christian multitude, to acknowledge that his own problems and his own pursuits are one with theirs, signals also a new appreciation of their dignity, a dignity grounded in man's creation in the image of God and in the common redemption of Christ, and in a recognition that the few and the many are alike in their need of the forgiveness of sin. The ground of the single but universal way of salvation in Christianity is the universal mediation of Christ, who unites eternal and temporal, God and man in his own person, and thereby knits together the divisions that plague human beings through grace offered in the one church he founded. Because eternal word became flesh, the highest things are now available, even to the lowliest of human beings, through discipleship in Christ. Even the meanest of Christians can no longer be considered city fodder. Nevertheless, the mediation of Christ does not abrogate human differences. The members of the meek flock in the presence of which Victorinus makes his profession do not become philosophers, nor is Victorinus constrained to give up his philosophic studies. Nor do the differences of law and custom among the nations disappear. After all, according to St. Paul, the body is one and has many members, and yet the eye does not become the ear, or all the different and varied bodily members change into eyes. Likewise, at Pentecost, according to Acts, the multitude came together, and they were bewildered because each one heard them speaking in his own language. Yet, this does not mean that all members of the church abandon their native languages and adopt one language. So we began with Hart's observation that before Christianity, human dignity was rare. I hope to have given a broadly Platonic, anthropological, psychological explanation of why that is, and then followed up with an Augustinian explanation of why Christianity can ground the dignity of the multitude. All are made in the image of God, and in principle are redeemed by Christ. Through the mediation of the Word who became flesh, even the non-philosophic many are capable of pursuing the highest things. Augustine writes, "For in Christ they have the most gracious cleansing, in which mind, spirit, and body alike participate. For in order that he might heal the whole man from the plague of sin, he took without sin the whole human nature." Yet in Augustine's articulation of Christ's mediation, membership in the church and reception of grace does not impose uniformity in customs and laws, but rather establishes communion on a higher level. Of course, we still suffer divisions in this vale of tears as we, quote, complete what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of the body, in the words of St. Paul in Colossians, and as we hope for and look forward to perfect communion with the Lord. Thank you.
Next, we'll have Dr. Ashleen Bagnulo from the outstanding Texas State Political Science Department. And she'll be talking about what I think is one of the most important stories from the Roman Republic and one of the most important and interesting passages from the Augustine City of God. And it's also important for Shakespeare, The Rape of Lucretia. And her paper is titled Beyond Purity, St. Augustine's Defense of the Human Dignity of Rape Victims.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks so much, Chris. I hope I do justice to the story of Lucretia. And thank you, panelists, and thank you, everyone who attends. Can you hear me okay? Yep. Okay, good. So I'm going to begin just by briefly retelling the story of the rape of Lucretia. I'm using Livy as kind of my primary guide for the narrative. You might know the story already, you might not, but it's about a noble woman who is Roman, who inflames the passion of a debauched, tyrannical prince because she is chaste. Specifically, that's what the text says. So he comes up with a plan to, while her husband is away on a military campaign, to stay at her house and have their house's hospitality. And she receives him in the house, and then he comes and he tries to seduce her. And she says, no, I don't want to have sex with you. And then he says, well, then I'll kill you. And she says, I don't care if you kill me. I don't want to have sex with you. And then finally he says, I will kill your slave, your male slave, and put him in your bed and kill you. And then everyone will think, because I will tell them, that I caught you in adultery, and you will lose your honor. And so she succumbs to him. That's the story. It ends with her committing suicide to prove what she did, that she did not, that she was raped, right? She's trying to show that she's penalized in some way. So I want to start by drawing attention to points of resonance on my research on Lucretia and Augustine that we have for the situation we find ourselves in as a church and as a culture. I'm trying to recover the voice of an ancient father. Maybe I'm doing what Dan says we shouldn't do, to explain why sexual assault is so destructive and how it operates. And I think if we can do this, we can understand our reasons for being against it. So what is my stalking horse here? My stalking horse is a few things I'll mention in the essay specifically, but it's also the idea that the basis of our secular defense for why rape is wrong is consent. And so I'm trying to get beyond that, but I'm also trying to get beyond purity culture, basically. So Augustine uses the rape of Lucretia as an example of lust for domination, and he roots her freedom from the sin of adultery in an understanding of conscience, emphasizing sexual consent, actually. This leads me to one point of resonance. In The City of God, Augustine gives us a way of understanding both why consent is an important point of focus for sexual relations, even if it's not the exclusive point, and why coerced consent is not consent at all. We know from our experience of our last few years that we had the Me Too crisis. And a lot of critics of the crisis, there are a lot of critiques that you can make about the movement. But one common one was that the women, specifically the ones in Hollywood, were involved in a kind of quid pro quo with their directors. And so you couldn't really say that this was an example of any more dysfunction than just the dysfunction of immoral people having sex with each other for their, like, to make a transaction. Actresses gave sexual favors, they reasoned, for the sake of professional favors, and now regretted their choice. As the Catholic Church scandal emerges, so I'm thinking here of what started to happen. I started thinking about this because of something Rodrera ran about sexual assault in a Orthodox Catholic, but Orthodox traditional religious community. And we also have learned about it from everything that has happened in the McCarrick scandal. So here, I think actually we as Catholics are doing a better job of understanding, because of these things, how the phenomena of sexual assault works. And we saw it more clearly, I think, in the stories of unwilling seminarians and predatory older clerics who preyed on them and manipulated their spiritual and professional dependency to abuse them. Augustine, I'm saying, gives us a way to understand the seminarians and the actresses. His account of Lucretia's rape also gives us a way to understand the link between sexual assault and domination. There is an old saw about sexual assault that rape is not about sex, but about power. And in the fallout of these sex scandals, you've seen some Catholic commentators push back on that insight by suggesting that by saying sexual assault is about power, not about sex, you're participating in reducing everything to power plays, which is something that the culture does generally and is a sign of dysfunction. It ignores the important role that habituation and ideas about sex sacredness play in preventing things like sexual assault on this account. To employ a metaphor used by Mike Pakolak, I'm sorry I butchered the name, we think sex is play. So we misunderstand its seriousness. So then the idea is if we change the terms of sex being serious, we would get out of this concept of play. And I think one of the things that if you think about that with regard to Augustine's account of rape as a phenomenon of domination, You can ask what kind of person engages in play with a partner they've bullied or forced and still finds pleasure in that play. Only a certain kind of person can do that, and that is a person who finds pleasure in the domination of another. My point in saying this is that if we were to say, increase the status of sex in our society as something sacred, which is something I think we should do, that's not going to stop the problem of sexual assault. Because the way that sex works, even in the concepts of play, you will have some people who will take that situation and will enjoy forcing their partner, will enjoy coercing their partner, will enjoy making sex a sort of way to get off, it's a human fleshlight. Only a certain kind of person can do that. And they exemplify the lust for domination. Augustine also shows us the shattering effect of rape. When commenting in passing on the women who have killed themselves to avoid being raped during the sack of Rome, he says, "What person of human feeling, then, would refuse to forgive these women who for this reason slew themselves, rather than suffer in such a way?" One theme that constantly emerges in the stories of sexual assault survivors is that many of the victims of the assault spend the rest of their lives pursuing different forms of self-destruction. Augustine helps us explain why. The idea that it would have been better to die than to have gone through that. But Augustine also helps us to understand the way out of that. I'm quoting McConey here, who I think wrote a really good piece on Augustine. He says, "Jesus is the only stranger to self-loathing because he is the only one whose vulnera, whose wounds, are victorious. In these wounds, Augustine learned to quit further destroying himself and to seek the God-given integrity and wholeness that results in salvation." So I'm going to move a bit from cultural analysis to my idea of how we can get deeper than consent. So as others have established, Augustine's recognition of the suffering of rape victims is an important difference between him and earlier fathers. Whereas Ambrose, Tertullian, and Jerome suggest that self-killing to avoid defilement, that's what they call it, may be saintly, and that Lucretia is a model of chastity, Augustine condemns Lucretia's suicide and frees raped women from the burden of misplaced guilt and shame. Women, Western thought, and Christianity owe Augustine a widely underappreciated debt for this. I think the extent of the debt is clearer upon reflection when we can see the connection between Augustine's confrontation of a problem that deeply affected women and his connection of it to his great foe, the lust for domination. And John Cavadini of this institution has a great piece comparing Andrea Dworkin's account of violative sex and Augustine's account of violative sex. And you can point to it in the City of God when the young bride, has to kind of be held down. So there are two obstacles to fully appreciating Augustine's message on these things. For the life of the soul and for political life. And one of them is that people say Augustine is misogynistic. I'm not really worried about that with this audience, but we can talk about it in the Q&A. The second tension is more difficult. Augustine's acceptance of the need to tolerate or commit what he considers unfortunate cruelties in this life. His account here is not consequentialist, but instead centers on intentions. In Book 19, we have the just judge who prays to be delivered from his necessities, yet appropriately engages in torture when unavoidable. A similar dynamic occurs in his decision to compel the Donatists. Why would Augustine not accept, like Ambrose, that in order to avoid the sin of the lust of another, or the bodily defilement that their lust brings, it is holy to escape your rapist by dying? To bring up a contemporary example, some devotees of St. Maria Goretti, who I love St. Maria Goretti, a 20th century Italian peasant girl killed after refusing the sexual advances of her would-be rapist, uphold her example of purity precisely for those kinds of reasons, right? That she escaped defilement and escaped some sort of sin. I actually remember being taught that in my purity group, that when I was in high school, that, if someone tried to attack you, that, and they wanted to kill you, it might be better just to let them kill you. I was like 16. You heard that. In this interpretation, Maria would rather die than let her attacker sin, or let herself sin by accepting his advances. On this account, her purity is intact, because rather than be raped, she resisted him to the point of death. But if you read Book 1 of The City of God, this is very an Augustinian understanding of Maria Goretti. But if we see Augustine as one who countenances tragedy out of regard for a greater good, so like the just judge example I used earlier, why wouldn't Maria Goretti's death just be the unfortunate but appropriate coin to pay when faced with the reality of lust? Our answer comes into view with the phenomena of a triumphant conscience of the righteous person who is dominated or oppressed. At least a part of Augustine's development of the importance of sexual consent and conscience is rooted in his understanding of the limits upon perfect freedom of choice for men and women in this life. The choice of the will, then, is truly free only when it is not the slave of vices and sins. In this sense, for him, a slave can be free if interiorly well ordered. At this point, I'll just briefly review his concept of conscience. He's considered the father of conscience to some scholars, because he has this idea that our will makes choices which God sees and knows, right? Even if others can't, because they're hidden. And this is actually an important part of his politics. Our experience of political regimes on earth is often one of disorder and injustice. For this reason, he says, there are instances when the righteous man must be content with the sole witness and consolation of a good conscience, end quote. Importantly, conscience is essentially connected to the concept of consent for Augustine. And on Genesis, against the Manichees, Augustine says that conscience is held guilty by reason of the consent. This comports with passages from the City of God. Suppose that some female already corrupted in mind is going to meet her seducer. Do we say that while she's on her way there, she is still holy in body? To work backwards, in the case of rape victims, sanctity of body, he says, is not lost while sanctity of mind remains, even if the body is overpowered. Augustine's attitude towards conscience is developed enough that he understands what many Romans and early Christian thinkers don't. Enduring non-consensual sex is blameless. But Augustine is more radical, as is revealed by a return to Livy, which shows us that for Augustine, coerced consent in sex is not consent. In Livy, when Tarquin comes to Lucretia's room at night, he tries to seduce her and he refuses. She refuses. Next, he threatens her with death, but she doesn't fear death. Then he threatens her with false accusations of adultery and death, and that's the point she stops resisting. She was willing to resist to the point of death, but she would not accept dishonor. The breaking point for her is the loss of social standing and discrediting of her moral character, which I don't mean to dismiss. Why does this matter? Because what coerced her into stopping her resistance to Tarquin was not physical power, but non-physical, psychological coercion. Even though she stopped resisting, Augustine still views what happened to her as rape. And then I will just wrap up by reading this last part really quickly. So let's revisit the story of the just judge with these insights in mind. Roberts Ogle claims that the text is altered by its content. So if you look at Book 19, the just judge is situated in an extended reflection on the insufficiency of human theories of happiness. So the just judge actually is, quote, wise according to the Stoics, who believed torture alone made truth-telling possible and made Rome's legal status functional. Apatheia in Augustine's account in Book 14 is conceived of as a mastery of the interior life, despite what might happen to the body. Isn't this the kind of thing Augustine thinks can happen in the case of a rape victim? This leaves us with the portrait of the rape victim as the one who triumphs by putting mind over matter. Something we know in Book 14 is an unintegrated account of the human will. So what is the difference? I think the difference is conscience's unifying of what many ancients perceived to be dual parts of a human. When someone is raped on Augustine's account, something truly destructive is happening to them. For Augustine's Stoic, mastery of emotions like fear and anguish are what allow us to see that no evil could really befall a good man. But Augustine can say these are evils. I extend the analogy to the Roman justice system and torture. and sort of point out the relationship between rape and torture traditionally. But ultimately, the critical move I think Augustine makes is that in his discussion of the rape victim, you see that he prioritized not disassociating from one's body, not trying to overcome trauma with stoical virtue, but to take solace in one's conscience, which is known to the wounded God. And that is something the rapist cannot touch.
Last but not least, we have Notre Dame's Mary Keyes, and she did a paper with Notre Dame's Melody Grubaugh, and it's going to present some original archival research, actually, in this paper, and it's titled Augustinian Aspects of Charles Malek's Defense of Human Dignity.
Okay, thank you, and thank you to my co-author, Melody Grubaugh, who's a PhD student here at Notre Dame and is in Oxford this semester, so she can't be here for the presentation. Hopefully later she'll watch it and she can critique my summary, so we'll see. In this paper, this is actually part of a paper on Augustine's humility, his virtue, in the context of MacIntyre's Virtues of Acknowledged Dependence, Augustine's account of humility as a form of natural justice, what is just for the human person and human society. And then it looks at the impact of that view on the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of 1948. And one thing that I expected to find some work of Maritain that would be helpful in this project that was suggested by some editors of a volume. But what we found that was, at least for me, exciting and opening up a whole new area of research that I've just begun to look at is a clear connection between the thought of Augustine and the thought of Charles Malek, who was one of the framers of the United Nations Universal Declaration. He's a Lebanese philosopher diplomat who, studied with Whitehead at Harvard and briefly with Heidegger at Freiburg, but was horrified by the Nazi environment and left running before he had finished his time there. What I'd like to do then, we were able to go to the archive at the Library of Congress, which had just reopened this summer, and look at some of Malek's papers after the research train led us back there. And I'll share some of that research today as best I can in the time limit, so it may be a bit rushed, for which I apologize in advance. So Charles Habib Malek, philosophy professor and diplomat from Lebanon, served as one of the core team of framers of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Together with P.C. Cheng of China, he's been described as, quote, intellectually dominating the Commission on Human Rights. One scholar maintains that Malek's elections to key positions during the final phase of the work on the United Nations Universal Declaration was of great importance when the time came to vote on the declaration in the General Assembly. Malek was a devout, ecumenically minded Greek Orthodox Christian. He was drawn to experientially based philosophies of the phenomenological and existentialist schools. His philosophical readings also stretched back to the Greek philosophers and to late classical and medieval thought. In the scholarly literature on Malek and his impact on the Universal Declaration, Malek's existentialist and Thomist influences are frequently stressed, and certainly rightly so. His affinity for Augustine, by contrast, is generally underestimated in the literature. There are a couple exceptions, important exceptions, and has not yet been the object of any sustained study. So this is where our paper enters the dialogue. Melody Grubaugh and I consider Malek's philosophical approach and his reflections later on the Declaration on Human Rights as in critical respects Augustinian, reflecting a lifelong reading of and reflection on Augustine's Confession, City of God, and other works. Awareness of the Augustinian aspects of Malek's philosophical and diplomatic projects can deepen our understanding of his vision of natural right and human rights. human dignity, and also highlight the importance of Augustine's humility, his defense of humility in that account. So Augustine and Malik's studies and academic work, and here I'll give a little summary of what we found in the archive and in some of his philosophical writings. Charles Malik began his academic career at the American University in Beirut, spearheading efforts to establish its cultural studies program and its philosophy department. Documents in the Malik Papers in the Library of Congress reveal the importance of Augustine in the early stages of Malik's philosophical scholarly career, and this anticipates by several years his work on the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. Augustine is included in Malik's undated handwritten list of select, quote, authors to be read by people seeking philosophic illumination. And illumination is underscored twice by Malik. Augustine figures in this short list. And in suggestions of important philosophers to be studied in a 1937 memo, The Philosophic Position at the American University of Beirut. In a subsequent document in which Malik lays out his proposal for the philosophy curriculum at the university for the 1938-39 academic year, Malik describes official course offerings, there are 4, and then he highlights a fifth unofficial offering, a, quote, Augustine Circle, in which an anthology of Augustine's writings would be studied. And Malik writes, every person who thinks he can profit by studying this founder of Christian thought, and who is willing to lay aside throughout the year some 4 hours a week, 2 for reading, 2 for discussion, all right, is welcome to join the circle. This appears to have been the first of a series of highly influential study circles organized and led by Malik from 1938 to 1944 in Beirut. A year after the Augustine Circle's completion in 1940-41, Malik taught a seminar on Augustine's thought to upper-level students at the American University of Beirut. The Augustinian themes that find the most pervasive, forceful echo in the philosophical writings and speeches of Malik include the creation of the world ex nihilo by God, the goodness and wonder of being, humility as the loving acknowledgement of our creaturely status and recognition of our sinfulness and need for repentance, the peril of prideful self-sufficiency, or the pride of self-sufficiency, which Malik terms the source of all evil and all untruth, the centrality of the person, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Malik's commentaries on some of the great modern and contemporary philosophers from the beginning to the end of his career balance a sincere appreciation of their achievements with critiques explicitly and implicitly centered on Augustinian themes. So just to give one example among many, the core of Malik's critique of Heidegger's thought, this is in a 1977 article, in which Malik finds much to appreciate in Heidegger's thought, but his critique centers around what he finds to be its immanentization or humanization of properly theological questions, an avoidance of a personal encounter with Christ, this is all from Malik, and the instantiation of what Malik calls the pride of self-sufficient man, especially the pride of the philosopher, end of quote. In the text for his lecture, Malik's lecture, Man and Transcendence, which was given in Beirut in 1953, Malik foreshadowed this critique of Heidegger. He observes there that what he calls the pride of self-sufficient knowledge, underscored in his manuscript, the pride of self-sufficient knowledge is the greatest temptation to which our nature is prone, end of quote. Malik also takes up the distinctively Augustinian theme of humility in his philosophical theological work, The Wonder of Being. And the very title is very Augustinian, The Wonder of Being. This Augustinian nature is evinced in the titles of the book's 3 parts. The first is The Cosmological Argument, the good of insufficiency for humans. 2, The World, the evil of sufficiency. 3, Jesus Christ, in him all fullness dwells. This book's central section highlights Augustine's emphasis on the need, after the creator has descended to the creature, for the creature to ascend to the creator. And therefore, and here I quote, the danger of worshiping the creature, that is, holding it as final and self-sufficient rather than the creator. And he develops this and cites Augustine, 4 long quotes directly in the text from Augustine. Okay, so the last years of Malik's university life, which were in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, also evinced a profoundly Augustinian dimension. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, Malik urges academic and other audiences to read Augustine slowly and with care. He says, take a year, take 3 years, take your time, read. A noteworthy facet of Malik's Augustinianism in this phase of his career is an emphasis on the city of God. A pamphlet entitled Repentance, the Key, which appears to be the printed version of an address given in Washington in 1979, contains this striking statement, quote, "If there were one book I would recommend that you read, other than the Bible, to have your life and the events around you wholly illumined," in this theme of illumination, right, wholly illumined, it would be Augustine's City of God. In 1981, in Malik's first year as the Jacques Maritain Distinguished Professor of Moral and Political Philosophy, this is a Catholic university and the last academic post he would hold, Malik gave a series of lectures entitled St. Augustine's City of God, a few reflections on ourselves and our age, induced by Augustine's City of God. And these are available online, and audio recording, 3 of 4, are still available. In his opening lecture, Augustine's Greatness, Malik describes, quote, meeting Augustine as an outstanding event in one's life. Again, he says that the City of God is probably Augustine's greatest work, and outside the Bible, no other work equally rewards one's time and reflection. And perhaps Malik accords the City of God, I'll step back and say, in his early writings, I think the confessions predominate. Right? And so later in his career, he seems to emphasize the City of God more. Perhaps that's because he's spent decades in diplomatic, political, very practical work. And not least of these was his framing and working for the passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I'll finish with some consideration condensed of Malik's appraisal of the Declaration in both its Augustinian aspects and what I think he considers as some shortcomings of the Declaration from an Augustinian perspective. So Malik's contributions to and commentaries on the debates on the Declaration and his published reflections on the Declaration after its approval reflect the Augustinianism of his thought and practice. For Malik, the Universal Declaration's passage was a universal achievement, truly universal, reflecting widely shared agreement on basic notions of justice, on what is right in the life and treatment of human beings and their association. Malik saw this consensus as indicative of our common humanity, a shared human nature or essence, which in turn points beyond itself to God as creator, providential governor, and redeemer. Malik's most significant critique of the Declaration in its final form is that it lacks a clear, specific reference to nature, just deleted at a key moment in the debate, lack of consensus about what it meant and its role. So a lack of a clear, specific reference to nature as grounding human rights, and to God as creator. And this, he notes, was impossible to insert. It came up in the debate, but it was never in the draft, could never make it into the draft. And in this context, he speaks about what he considers chief threats to the questions that the Declaration raises, the project of human dignity broadly construed. These are materialism, and again, they go back, I think, to his Augustinianism. The first is materialism. As important as the body is, the soul is greater, and the goods of the soul are more are more essential, even though the goods of the body are essential. That's also, as several speakers have pointed out, very important for Augustine. And then the second danger is false human self-sufficiency or even self-worship, which besets both spirit and body. And I'll just read a very brief quote from Malik that highlights an Augustinian understanding of humility. He says, Malik writes, "If we have our rights," this isn't a published reflection on the Declaration itself, right? "If we have our rights, God also has his rights over us. And in vain will we seek our rights until we recognize in all humility the dominion of God over the course of human history and all human life." Let's see. I think I still possibly have a couple minutes, so I will. Do I have a couple minutes, or am I? I'm done. Okay, perfect. So I can, no problem. That's great. So I'll just say in 2 sentences or less that Malik also sees the Declaration, which does say that the family is the natural unit of human society, and that is in the secondary literature attributed to Malik himself, getting that in there, that it's a natural fundamental unit, and that the Declaration says that humans are born with rights and endowed with rights, that those are intentionally left ambiguous as compromise formulations so that one could read a natural law and God as creator, Augustinian perspective in, or one could deny those and one could still affirm the Declaration. So, thank you.
All right, I think we have about 7 minutes for questions, so you are welcome to go to the mic over there, and hopefully we'll get a few in here, and maybe just mention which professor you'd like to ask the question to.
Hi. So I'm going to address this to Professor Burns, but it could have been addressed to almost anyone. So in your talk, Professor, you expressed Augustine's view of human dignity such that even man's vice reflects human dignity insofar as the mind seeks an apparent good, or words to that effect. I'm curious how you see that in relation to, if not Thomas's view, then McIntyre's view of DeConnick's view of Thomas's view yesterday. If you see them as compatible, if so, how? If you see them as distinct, and if so, how?
It's the dimmer switch.
Subliminal message.
Yeah, the dimmer switch, yeah.
I'd just ask you do you want to briefly state where the possible incompatibility is? No incompatibility had struck me.
Okay, so I do have the quote from Aquinas in front of me. By sinning, man departs from the order of reason and consequently falls away from the dignity of his manhood, insofar as he's naturally free and exists for himself, and he falls into the servile state of the beasts by being disposed of according to as he is useful to others. And this is in the question on capital punishment specifically and whether it is lawful to kill sinners, concluding ultimately that it is.
Yeah, so Augustine doesn't, as I mentioned, he doesn't speak in terms of the dignity, property of human beings the way that Aquinas explicitly does. And so I was trying to, reconstruct what he would say about how I defined our conception of human dignity. So I don't see him as saying anything that's incompatible with that. I didn't mean to say, and if I can go back and try to find what I said that sounded like it was incompatible with that, but I don't see Augustine as, even that passage in Aquinas refers to our free will, which of course is something that distinguishes us from human beings. So even for Aquinas, it's still a sign, our capacity to make this kind of choice is still a sign of the dignity with which God has endowed us. But that's a dignity that can be, if you like, erased. You could put it in those terms, I suppose, or I don't know about erased, but contradicted.
That is the heart of my question. Yeah, sorry.
Well, I mean, it would be self-contradictory to say that you remove your free will by misusing your free will. You obviously don't remove your free will, but you can remove your right to be treated in a way that, well, you can remove your right not to be killed. That's the point in question, right? We don't normally kill human beings, but it is possible by abuse of your free will to do something that requires people to kill you. Augustine is fully in support of capital punishment in principle. In practice, he intervened on behalf of every condemned criminal he knew, but he didn't have a problem with the right to capital punishment.
Okay, and gentlemen.
Yes.
Yes.
This is for Professor Keyes. You mentioned Jacques Maritain in passing, and I wondered whether you could offer maybe another couple of minutes of reflections on any connections, intellectual or otherwise, between Charles Malik and Jacques Maritain. And in part I ask because it's striking that the Maritains famously ran a Thomistic study circle with Father Garrigou-Lagrange in Paris, or outside Paris, from 1921 or 22 to 1938, and then Charles Malik launches his Augustinian study circle, which is fascinating. I wonder if there's any connection there in particular.
No,
thank you for a great paper.
Well, thank you, Professor Shaw, and for your work on religious freedom. So the short answer is there's research to be done. So, and you may know more than you're letting on. I think this is the gentleman who asked the question is one of the world's experts on these questions. But I think. So what I can say is so Malik's archive also shows that early on he owned books by Maritain and recommended them to people. And I myself was just wondering today, I think I recently heard about Maritain study circles, and I was just thinking, I wonder if that's a precursor. But I don't have any evidence for that. And I had trouble in the archive finding clear connections between Maritain and Malik. I bet that there's a lot there. And also we have Professor Payares from Mexico who's done research on that I'm just becoming aware of. So this is great on this.
We have Marianne Glenn
We should
coming
probably
tonight.
have Professor Payares to answer the question, who I think has written on this. Yeah.
Thank you.
But no, thank you. That's a great question.
Okay.
Hi there, my name is Ted Koval. I'm from Benedictine College. And the question I had was on Augustine's view on justice and how it's giving each its due. And this is directed at any of the professors. To what extent are they due, like, the punishment after breaking the law? And to what extent are they due the mercy? And what's the balance in kind of finding that?
Any professor in particular?
Particularly Professor Keyes.
I'm just a
professors.
theologian, so you know.
I thought I'd be off the hook on this one. Could you please repeat the question?
Sure.
Just to make sure I know I got the gist.
Sure, no
but,
worries.
yeah.
So for like lawbreakers or those who perpetrate the law, to what extent, obviously, are they due the punishment that has to come with that? And then to what extent are they due the mercy that they have from being a human?
So I'll partially answer and partially punt. I think for, at least on my reading, Augustine on mercy is more than remission of punishment. So it's more than clemency, right? And it can incorporate that, and it can motivate clemency. But mercy, and so what Augustine explicitly says in the City of God is that mercy should not be exercised to the detriment of justice. But is it always required by justice that a particularly harsh, or is it ever in certain circumstances? You know, we could perhaps push Augustine on this if he were here and see what he would think in contemporary times. But so I think Augustine, his theory would argue that if you don't need to impose a particularly harsh punishment, it might even be unjust to do so. But he doesn't rule it out in principle. I think that's correct, that you might need to.
Thank you. So this is just built, your comment made me think of this, which is that in the City of God, in Book 10, Augustine talks about latria, which is right worship. And it becomes a form of justice, right, towards God. Justice towards God is right worship. But then right worship at some point in Book 10 becomes connected. It becomes connected to more traditional senses of worship, but it becomes connected to mercy. That mercy is what we owe in God, to God, as a part of right worship. And the implication is that, at least in my reading, that Augustine is noticing something, which is that we owe each other mercy because God gave us mercy, but what God wants from us is to show mercy toward others. I think, though, that there's not necessarily this tight distinction between mercy and justice, because he does kind of do that move. That's all I had to say.
And this will have to be the last comment, I think, as we're out of time.
Okay. Yeah, I don't remember well enough how Augustine uses the specific word mercy. I agree with Dr. Keyes that what you're talking about would be more his distinction between justice and clemency. And I think Augustine's thinking on all of this is basically identical to Cicero's, which I can summarize briefly. According to strict rules of justice or natural law or natural right, only good people really deserve all this stuff, and bad people don't deserve it because they use it badly. In practice, that's completely impossible, and therefore the best approximation of it in this life is rule of law, which is imperfect in all sorts of ways, and that's part of the big argument for clemency, is that any legal system includes imperfections, and what Augustine adds to that he inherits is the role of the church in pleading for clemency. That it's really a civic role of the church. He thinks, look, the judges always have to be basically on the side of justice, but the judges benefit from having bishops there to push them on clemency, and the bishops will always push, and they'll often get turned down, but they should always push, and there's a kind of healthy balance between the two.
Thanks so much.
So in justice and clemency, let's give them a hand.